Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Urban Legends. So, Urban Legends is 1998, I guess, because evidently there was two different other movies that came up after this. I'll admit I saw Urban Legends Final Cut. I saw that movie, and I think at the end of that movie, they end up doing a movie about the movie because evidently there was some whole film school kind of thing for the second film. Here's the goofy thing. So evidently Urban Legends Final Cut wasn't evidently final enough for these people, and so they had to do another movie called Urban Legends Bloody Mary, I guess? Because that makes a whole lot of sense. I guess they just figured, hey, we'll just keep doing these movies and they'll make money. Not so much. When you kind of put the word final cut or final into a sequel of it, you assume there's never going to be another one of these. But then you'd be wrong. Anyways, I think I ended up seeing the trailer for Urban Legends Bloody Mary, but I didn't think it was actually ever going to come out or be a thing that people wanted to see. And surefire enough, I didn't even know it existed. So it went really well, right? Anyways, so going into this, I really enjoy this movie simply because there's certain things that kind of feel that they just kind of just became a thing because of this movie. We have the moment where Michelle is to be singing in the very beginning of this movie and kind of singing, just not, And so I think a scary movie had taken that moment and kind of copied it. And so we have the one girl from Scary Movie who's singing, and all of a sudden, we have the girl who's actually singing the song stopping this girl from singing, just excuse me. It's I'm singing this song. And then the girl's oh, sorry. It's yeah, bitch. And then she starts going on and singing the song, and the girl is just yeah, I guess I shouldn't have sang that song. I think they probably got that moment from Urban Legends, but who knows? So going also in this movie, it's interesting to see the spot where Wexler is to talk about that one urban legend where the call's coming from inside the house. I'm so wait a minute, that's from When a Stranger Calls. I remember that movie and then the remake that had to happen afterwards where they were trying to hey, we could do some really cool and interesting stuff with this film. We could really make it up to date and it'll be really cool. And I'm just I don't know. I don't really think either one of them made a drastic impact from yeah, they updated it, but I don't think it was wow, you really just changed everything. You reinvented that wheel. Man, you did. Not really. There's only so much things you could do for that film. So, Urban Legends, how did I feel about this movie? I find it fun. I like this film. I would say it's a solid, good film. At least. Really, the only problem that I probably have with this film, it feels like they easily make you have a limitation on who the killer could probably be. Because it doesn't really seem like there's enough people in this cast that could really just be who could the killer be? Well, it obviously has to be two people, because it really gets to the point where you're just naturally assuming, okay, it can't be this person, can't be that person. Why would it be this person? That doesn't make sense. And so all of a sudden you just really just quickly come to the consensus is well, it probably has to be this one girl, or it probably has to be this one guy, or because two people are left to really just to figure out who it is. And it can't be the main character because main character. And the damsel in distress that has to be running around this whole entire movie can't be the killer. So yeah, they kind of quickly limit who the killer is, unless it's to be one of those practical jokes at the end of all this, where it's to be the Cry Wolf situation. If people have ever seen the movie Cry Wolf, where at the end of the movie we end up finding out that basically everyone just started to disguise themselves as the killer because like everyone was to eventually just supposedly die off, but it was all to just be a prank where none of them died off. That they were just getting back at this one person. Could have been that. That could have been cool, and like that would have been interesting to have like that very end scenario where you see everybody just die off, and then all of a sudden you end up finding out that like, hey, it's a prank, bro. Hey, that would have been cool. I would have liked that. But anyways, so weirdly enough, we have this campus who has this thing called the Stanley Hall Massacre. And so we technically have a legend already in a campus that no one is going to just copy and paste from. They just decide to just do urban legends instead. So we already have a tradition of something that people have anniversarily followed. But no, we're just going to go and kill people by urban legends. Because we have this whole past of a thing that is to tie the murderer to the damsel that is to be running around, scared. So we have to admit that there's a really good cast in here, with just kind of a lot to play with. But again, like it limits who the killer is. It does. But anyways, it's about that customary time, because you basically, when you're thinking, oh, it could just be the random weird janitor person. Yeah, they snuff that out. They snuff it. Anyways, plus they try to snuff the whole like Brenda situation where like she's to be like swimming in the pool, and like Brenda is to think that Natalie is thinking that Brenda is going to die. So they kind of try to rule everything out, that with the exclusion of the whole Jared Leto thing, because they just didn't have that kind of time. So with that said, let's go out of our way to go into spoiler territory of this movie. Let me know how you feel about the movie Urban Legend. I thought it was I enjoy it. People could probably say that it doesn't hold up anymore, which I can understand that too. Or people could say, yeah, this movie sucks, or yeah, I love it, or yeah, final cut. I saw all three of the Urban Legend movies. Okay, I didn't. I saw at least two of them, but I didn't see the third one. So, let's go out of our way to say that it's about that customary time, because it is spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time we spoil this movie. So, very beginning, of course, we have Michelle, who is to be singing along to some song on the radio. She's trying her best. I wonder why, I wonder who had the decision of, hey, we want you to sing this song, but, do you know how to sing? Well, yes. Well, how about you just not do it well? Try to not do it well. Just try to just say some words, make up some goofy stuff along the way. Unless that's actually how Michelle sings Natasha, then I apologize. But if they were to have the plan of just hey, just sing this song, but sing it bad, because people will remember that in the movie. So Michelle goes off and is singing her little ditty, and so the song is to consistently warn her about going and looking behind her, or seeing something from behind, or going and looking, giving a little look back, So this song is to basically foreshadow that something is going to happen in her backseat. Yeah, something's going to happen. So we have Michelle who ends up parking herself by this gas station. And so all of a sudden, here's the goofy thing. So Michelle is way too trusting. She ends up just giving this gas station attendant her credit card. Like, here, just take it and just put some frequent flyer miles on that bad boy. So just go ahead and just take the whole thing and max it out. Just buy yourself some Slim Jims and some beef jerky, the teriyaki nugget kind, because oh man, those are good. Some sour Skittles, just ring that up. Just ring it all up. Just get yourself some cashew nuts. Come on, yeah. Just have some enjoyable time. So Brad is trying to figure out how he can max out this whole credit card situation, because Brad does not have an actual name in this movie. He's just called gas station attendant. This guy went from Chucky to gas station attendant. Anybody a little ticked off about that? Anyways, so we have Brad, because he has no name, coming back to the car and saying hey, it seems that the credit card company is on the phone. So you better come in here so that way you can answer this phone call. And she's like, okay. So she ends up going into the gas station to try and grab the phone, and it goes as if there was no actual call there. And so now Brad is trying to and Brad had locked the gas station door so that way she can't get out of the gas station. You would have thought that this woman would have just knocked Brad down, even though he's freaking, I'm sure he's muscular. I'm sure he can take down anybody. Don't mess with freaking Brad. And so Michelle goes and she ends up breaking this giant window. Luckily, there's a giant window there for her to break through, right? How convenient was that? So Michelle goes through the window without hurting herself, because glass shards and whatever. So Michelle goes and is... Here's the thing. So she doesn't take the gas thing out of her car. So eventually she just rips this gas thing while speeding out of there. So, because Michelle gets into her car and just takes off, and that's when Brad gets out of the gas station. He's like, someone's in the back seat. And so Michelle is just like, hey man, I'm just gonna enjoy my music and just ha 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 ha. Hopefully everything, hopefully I have enough gas to get to wherever the heck I'm going, which is to death. Because all of a sudden we have a person that obviously is Eskimo Killer, because this person is decked out in the most wintry clothes during a time of which it doesn't make sense to have so much wintry clothes. But what else was this character going to wear? And plus also, I think, supposing the sequel, you can tell that they use different kind of variations of different kind of killers and whatever. But also, the killer kind of reminds me in this movie of Cry Wolf, where you just have a ski mask guy and freaking camouflage, and man did that look cool in Crying Wolf. But eventually the story of Crying Wolf just wasn't that good. Let's be brutally honest. Not as good as freaking Urban Legend. Let's say that. Anyways, there was no pushing on. Anyways, so we have eventually what we end up seeing, is just the axe bizarrely smashing out this girl's window and hanging out there for a while to just tell us that I guess this girl was killed somehow by having axe go through window. Because I'm sorry, but like if I were to have had been axe wielding person, which isn't that kind of difficult enough to like event like what I would have had happened if I were a person that did movie, which probably this was probably the cheapest way to do this kind of thing. I would have had like the axe in the head, and then both head and axe go out the window, or like the murderer could have chopped off the head, and what they could have done then was like axe could have like broken out of window, and then the head could have been flying out, and then just could have been said, oh, okay, like this is some real going on. But I don't know, I think they tried to like kind of like get like at a place where they can kind of easily edit this movie to where it can be formatted for TV, it seems like. Because that's, I think, what they tried to do here. Because eventually, Urban Legends went into TV. So, anyways, uh, they try to minimize some things here. So, anyways, people are to all find out that Michelle was to die. And so this ends up getting around. So we seemingly eventually find out somewhere in this film that evidently Natalie was best friends with Michelle. That supposedly they had gone and done cheerleading together and so on and so forth. Here's one thing that I have to get out of here though. So Natalie and Michelle were to do that urban legend prank. That's obviously a staple in this movie. And here's the thing. So Jared Leto in this film is to ask Natalie about the reckless endangerment kind of thing that she was to be uh, uh, having a record for. But Natalie never tells Jared Leto that story. She ends up instead telling Brenda that story about how she was involved in that car accident. Which I was like, okay, so she technically tells the wrong person about that whole reckless endangerment thing in this movie, but I guess that's all to really foreshadowing us to tell us that, well, who is going to eventually be the possible killer in this film? That's just me. Anyways, let's go. Let's go a little bit juicy, succulently, or into the movie a little bit more. So, uh, so the main thing to just kind of pull from here is that uh, this murder of Michelle's is to be already to be told as like, oh, this is another urban legends killing. Oh, that's interesting. And so we have the moment where all of a sudden Michael Rosenbaum is in this movie, and so he is to mention about the Stanley Hall massacre. He ends up bringing up that it seems that there had been one person who went through uh, uh, dorm to dorm to dorm or whatever, or campus whatever, and started to kill people and then killed themselves. So, and then like, and so it seems that he ended up bringing that up to just kind of let us know that there is to be this Stanley Hall massacre that should have actually been the real thing about this movie, but it wasn't. And so, but it seems it starts to get around that there is to be a urban legend that had killed Michelle. And so Michael is just like, well, what's going to be next? Are we going to get like spider eggs in our bubble gum? Like, what's going to be the next urban legend that eventually is going to start killing people? So all of a sudden, Paul is to eventually start like correcting uh, Parker's character, Parker Riley, who is Michael Rosenbaum. And so we eventually have just Paul, who's eventually coming. I was like, oh, I almost forgot the name. Paul is to come here and start to make a joke out of what Riley is really saying. And so it seems already off the bat we have Brenda, who just loves Paul. And we, of course, have that one moment where Brenda's like, oh, bye, Paul. And then we have Rosenbaum was like, bye, Paul. Because I don't know what it is. It seems like both of these characters just don't like one another in this movie, which I find to be hilarious. Where, like, we consistently have these interactions between Paul and Riley, where we immediately have it where, like, Michael is just to dispel what Paul is to say towards the back half of this movie, where in the beginning of this movie, Paul is to dispel what Riley is saying in the beginning of this film. So it's kind of like a tit for tat kind of situation going on in this movie. So where they kind of go back to that. So, but I'm sure probably Jared Leto and probably Michael Rosenbaum liked one another. I'm just saying that their characters just like, I don't know, is kind of this like, oh, well, I have to feel that I'm smarter than you. Oh, isn't that great? So that whole kind of situation in a film that is scripted and whichever. Anyways, pushing on. So we have Waxler, of course, Robert Englund. Yeah. Freaking Robert Englund. Anyways, freaking I watched The Midnight Man, freaking The Wishmaster, freaking watched this movie. Eventually, I hope eventually to maybe sometime around Halloween, I'll start busting out some Nightmare on Elm Street. I think at one time I was going to watch the very first Nightmare on Elm Street, but I don't know what happened. Like I think I was going to watch that somewhere around like probably last Halloween. I was gonna start watching Nightmare on Elm Street, but I don't know what happened that day. Maybe there was something like new that came out that I had to forcibly like do that. Because there's a lot of times where I have to watch something brand new, and maybe that just might have been one of those things where I was like, oh, so and so new episode of such and such came out that day, and then I probably forgot about it. That's bound to happen. That really sucked. Anyways, so Robert Englund is to, of course, be Wexler, Professor Wexler, and he is to mention about the urban legend of the babysitter who eventually gets this guy calling her from inside the house, which I'm like, when a stranger calls, yeah. So, so Wexler is trying to say like, okay, everybody, what is this? What is this story? And no one could really quite figure it out. And he's like, well, this one is an urban legend that ended up being made into a film later on. So, or whichever. Anyways, so there was to be this other urban legend that I guess was to be from some commercial. I've never seen this commercial, and I don't know how it became a thing. But I don't know. Maybe I should have YouTubed it to see if that this commercial does exist, because I don't remember it ever existed. So, Wexler is to, of course, have Brenda come up, because Brenda is kind of mentioning something about what's going on here. Shortly after Robert Englund was to get this ringtone, and Brenda was to laugh at that. And really the ringtone is just to foreshadow what's going on in the other part of this movie, when eventually some ringtone is going off and somebody's to be found. Delicious! Anyways, so pushing on. So Brenda comes up, and so we have Robert Englund, we have Wexler, who ends up tossing Brenda Pop Rocks. It's like, go ahead, just enjoy those Pop Rocks. Just enjoy them. And so Brenda goes and takes the Pop Rocks, and then so Wexler is like, hey, would you like a sip of Pepsi? Would you like the choice of a new generation of Pepsi? no sponsor in this movie, Pepsi? And so Brenda's like, no. And Wexler's like, well, why? Like, why won't you have Pop Rocks and Pepsi? Why? Because Brenda is to mention that there is to have been some urban legend that is to have a mixture of Pop Rocks and Pepsi could like ruin your body, for whatever she ended up actually saying, like ruin your insides or something like that. And so, and that is to have come from the give it to Mikey, he likes it. And Rosenbaum ends up saying the give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. Anyways, so we end up finding out that Mikey commercial, we end up finding that guy is alive and well, and many years later, still alive. So, really, they're just trying to dispel this urban legend that evidently Pop Rocks and Pepsi could ruin your body. And man, is that that's a good sponsor spot for both Pop Rocks and Pepsi. Like, yeah, just like, hey, yeah, combine these two things and it'll ruin your body forever. That's a good sponsor spot for this. No sponsor, I'm sure. They flipped the bill. They probably did. Anyways, they probably wanted to dispel that rumor. Both Pop Rocks and Pepsi were like colliding together specifically for this movie to disprove this rumor so people could enjoy both Pop Rocks and Pepsi without the caution of worrying if they were going to die. That's why those companies were thinking. Big ups to Pop Rocks. Big fan of those. I remember after this movie came out, I went on and I had like Pop Rocks and Pepsi too, just to kind of because I remember this movie and I was like, hey, let's have Pop Rocks and let's have Pepsi just to kind of just dispel this whole rumor because we were being funny. Plus, it just came from this movie. Like, I didn't even know that commercial exists, but okay. So, anyways, like Brenda didn't want to go and have the Pepsi. So all of a sudden, Joshua Jackson's character, who is to be Damon Brooks, comes up and is, of course, like, yeah, man. And then he ends up taking the Pepsi. And so Wexler is like, yeah, look, fine. Like, 2 people alive. Like, isn't this great? And then all of a sudden, we have Damon, who ends up just starting to go, and then he ends up, like, falling over. And he's like, and like Rosenbaum is like, oh my God, somebody called 911. You, get out there. Call 911. And so then we have Damon who's like, and then we finally end up just seeing him just, and then he's like, like, I gotcha. And then just, and then like Wexler is just like, oh, you said, so pushing on, we have that really funny moment in this movie. Rosenbaum's like, call 911. Anyways, pushing on. So, like, what if somebody actually did call 911, the cops and everybody came, and then freaking they would have found out it was a prank and whatever. But that's the whole funny thing about a movie scene is like, hey, nobody actually called. So anyways, pushing on. So, we have Natalie's, roommate in her, dorm or whatever that she's in, who's to be a girl named Tosh. Seems like Tosh is getting a lot of toshing going on, if you know what I mean. Because it seems when Natalie is to consistently go into a room to try to sleep any day of the week, it seems that Tosh is banging it away with some stranger guy that she has found. And so eventually, Natalie is to have to turn the lights on every time she's to have to come into her, or go into her own room. Like, she just has to come to the room in utter darkness, go to her bed, and freaking sleep because heaven forbid she actually turns on a light to go into the room or see like Tosh banging it away with any stranger that she consistently seems to meet every single night. I guess she goes through some chat room to find these guys. I don't know. But yeah, so we just have Natalie who's ending up having problems with her person that she's living with, a girl named Tosh. You would have thought that Natalie would have just changed rooms with somebody. It seems like that's not working out. But it seems that Natalie is just this stubborn person. It's like, no, I just want to consistently keep walking in on this girl, just banging it away, and have to listen to music because she just, like, I guess it's just that nice of a person, I guess. Anyways, so pushing on. So we get where eventually we have Natalie who is spending some time with Damon Brooks, and so it seems that Damon is wanting to have Natalie just kind of go and like have a night out, just have some fun, because Natalie is to remember about her friend and how her friend is dead, Michelle. So really, Damon is to just kind of supposedly try and comfort Natalie, but then comforting all of a sudden comes up with Damon making up stories to try to get into Natalie's supposed pants. Because we have Damon who lures Natalie into a car ride with him, and so Damon ends up eventually making up this story about his girlfriend who had died. And so all of a sudden, Natalie is just like, "Oh, your girlfriend? She passed away?" And like, you can kind of just see that Natalie's just not buying the story because Damon is a guy that has been known to be a pranker or a fabricator or a liar or whichever. So, not very trustful, this Damon guy, but it seems that, weirdly enough, Natalie can trust going in a car with Damon in some random part of woods, and Damon is to just say, well, hey, I'm going to go out and take a whiz, which I'm like, why can't you just wait till you eventually see this thing called an actual bathroom? But that's just me. Going out in the middle of the woods to just take a leak, like, for me, I just like, dude, I'm gonna wait till I finally see an actual bathroom, and then I'm just gonna go and take a leak. Like, if it's number twos, I'm like, I'll wait till I go home, you know what I'm saying? Because in the woods, I don't think so. Anyways, so Damon goes and takes a leak in the woods, and he's going to be taking something a little bit more than a leak in the woods, let's just say. So now we have the urban legend where a guy is to get hung over his car. And so Natalie is to get a scare from the killer, which forces her to then want to drive the car fairly quickly to drive it forward. And so that has, of course, Damon Brooks, who's kind of hanging on this noose. And, of course, he's like, don't start the car! But then she ends up, of course, starting the car as there's this little paddling of his feet on the very top of this car. Damon... Let me pause here for a second. Anyways, so Damon is telling Natalie don't start the car, but he's saying in such hushed tones that she won't be able to hear him. So Natalie starts driving the car, and of course we just have... Let me pause for again. Alright. Sorry about that. Things were happening. So I was sending a tweet. Whatever. Anyways, so Natalie drives forward, and then eventually she ends up getting hooked on something, which of course is the rope that is holding on to Damon, which is having him consistently being hung. So Natalie decides, well, considering I can't drive forward anymore, I might as well drive backwards. And so all of a sudden, Natalie drives quickly backwards to all of a sudden have Damon Brooks smashing onto her windshield. Now he's all like, I'm dead. And, like, I guess you won't be hearing the Dawson's Creek music anymore for however long that was on the radio station. So the very next so eventually, like, we are to eventually, of course, seemingly have people saying that Damon Brooks is to be missing because supposedly they couldn't have found his actual body, and they like, we have even, God, what is his name, the where is the guy, the Dean Adams mentioning, like, he's probably shacked up with some guy or some girl or some farm animal. That's probably where he's gone to. So going in, so, like, supposedly, like, bizarrely, we just have Damon who has gone missing, even though Natalie has seen his supposed dead body. And so Natalie's to talk about what had happened to her, but we have a lot of her friends that are just kind of dispelling this also. That we have Riley, who is to mention that it's like, well, hey, like, like, Damon does have like a double of his own body, like, just laying around just to prank people. Or you also know that he also has a blow up doll, but, like, hey, that's not really that's really not something you absolutely need to know about. So, like, all their friends are to basically just say that Damon was to be going off to some ski trip for the weekend, and that's why he's not actually here, reveling in the fact that he had pulled another just delicious prank upon one of his friends. So this guy, like, didn't bother to go aha to Natalie, and is okay, all right. So that kind of eventually just tells us what happens with just Damon's character, Joshua Jackson's character. Rest in peace, Mighty Duck Man. Mighty Duck Man, what kind of garbage is that? Anyways, pushing on. So now we're just going to go in a roundabout way and talk about all the other deaths that happen in this movie, because I'm not going to be able to perfectly inline every single death that happens in this movie, and I know that's bound to happen, because, like, I can probably remember all the deaths that happen, but I probably won't be able to easily remember which order they come in. So, with that said, the real next death that actually matters to me in this film is to really just talk about Tosh. So what ends up happening is Tosh is to eventually just type away upon her computer, and so she's having this chat with some supposed guy where she's to kind of mentions, like, hey, like, what's your favorite thing? And, like, they're to mention, like, lithium, and, like, this girl's like, my kind of guy. And so they end up having this chat together, and so this girl is like, well, hey, where are you at? And he's like, close. And so Tosh is to eventually say, it's like, well, hey, I'm going to get ready to meet you. Let me know what your room number is. And so Tosh goes and gets makeup up, because if she doesn't much need makeup, I guess you have to put on makeup now, I guess. So Tosh goes back to her room to eventually read what the person is to say, and the room that this person is to mention is yours. Like, what? And so we kind of have like that was kind of like when a stranger calls kind of moment. But anyways, so all of a sudden the lights are to be off, and so we just have the killer who ends up choking Tosh, and so what eventually happens is that Natalie ends up coming to the room and she's like, "Oh, I get it. Like, I won't turn on the light." And so Tosh is to, of course, get choked, and or what we are naturally assuming is getting choked because we see the killer, but Natalie doesn't. To all of a sudden just have this time when Natalie is to wake up, where all of a sudden Natalie's to see a thing of blood upon Tasha's bed, and so Natalie's to remove the covers of Tosh to see that evidently her hands were to have gotten like cut, her wrists were to have gotten cut, and so all of a sudden Natalie's to turn around to see like next to her bed this sign that says like aren't you glad you didn't turn on the light? Which I'm like, I'm sorry, but how would have this person have been able to, while this person was still in the room, like have been, how would, like, just straight up, how would this person been able to put up this sign before slicing her wrist? That doesn't make sense to me. Because she wouldn't have been able to do all that. Plus, also, anyway, pushing on. So Natalie ends up reporting her roommate's death. So that eventually leads to have Dean Adams going and talking to Natalie about this whole situation. And like he just easily writes it off as some kind of self-harm situation, and Natalie was trying to tell him, it's like, no, there was someone else in the room, and Dean Adams was like, well, there's no way to really confirm that, and plus, like, Natalie was just like, well, what was the note about? And it's like, well, that was just, must have been just some morbid self-harm note, let's just say, because let's try to avoid saying certain words. So I'm gonna have to pause here for a second. Good God. Ah. All right. Hopefully that'll be it for interruptions and stuff I need to go do. Anyways, uh, so yeah. So morbid self-harm note and so on and so forth. So we have eventually Paul, who is to seem to be interested in what is going on with Natalie, and so eventually what ends up happening is that we have both Paul and Natalie wanting to try to figure out maybe all of this is to be tied uh, to the Stanley Hall massacre, and so eventually Paul is to try and find the yearbook of the year of which that event had happened, and so coincidentally, it seems that the year of which the Stanley Hall massacre yearbook was to have been gone. And so eventually Paul was to find the weird janitor and eventually ask him, hey, like, what year, like, how have you been working here long? And so he's like, hey, do you know much about the Stanley Hall murders or massacre? And so the weird janitor kind of tells him, like, hey, talk to Wexler. So both Paul and Natalie decide to eventually go into Wexler's office because supposedly he was supposed to be there, but he wasn't. And so Paul just goes and takes a credit card and breaks into Wexler's office and decides to go further into some parts of Wexler's office to eventually find both the axe and the coat that was from uh, what looked like Michelle's death or killing or whatever. And so all of a sudden they assumed that someone probably came in to the office and then left, and so they kept quiet, but then eventually they assumed that whoever came in had left. So all of a sudden both Natalie and Paul are to leave to eventually see that Wexler is still there. It's like, aha, gotcha. So all of a sudden Dean Adams is to eventually see both Paul and Natalie after this whole situation has happened. And so Dean Adams had took it upon himself to get some background about what had happened to Natalie. And so he ended up finding out that Natalie had a reckless endangerment thing upon her file. And Natalie's like, well, I was already accepted here before that even happened. And he's like, well, lucky for you, because we wouldn't have accepted you. And so also, uh, Dean Adams had gotten Paul also fired from his journalist job. And Paul was like, well, how is it that you all of a sudden have executive power of firing me? And Dean Adams was like, well, I didn't. Like, I talked to your editor, uh, like, before I came here, and he fired you. So, not under my control. So, all of a sudden, we end up having Dean Adams, who ends up kind of going off because he's going to get out of there because it's the weekend. So, we all of a sudden have Reese Wilson, who's the rent-a-cop for this movie. He used to say, well, like, maybe we should double up on some more guards this weekend, because like it seems with kind of what's all going on, how there's certain uh, uh, supposedly certain murders that are happening, and all of a sudden certain kids have gone missing, and so on and so forth. We should probably double up on guards. And Dean Adams like, we don't have to do any of that stuff. Like, if anything, like, I'm sure the Damon Brooks kid is like shacked up with farm animals and whatever. Like I'm sure you were young once, and, and Molson's like, well, not that kind of young. So all of a sudden, Wilson ends up leaving. So what ends up happening is Dean Adams is to get kind of like prepared to go into his car. All of a sudden, we end up seeing a knife go into both uh, of Dean Adams' ankles, and he ends up dropping, and so he ends up kind of like trying to like drag his way through this parking lot for his car to eventually follow him as the parking brake or whatever is taken off of it. And so this car is like rolling. So the dean is making it all the way to eventually trying to get out of this parking thing, but he ends up just having this car falling on top of him, pushing into these spikes that are mainly used to uh, break break tires and stuff like that. He ends up falling on the tire spikes that ended up killing him. So there goes the dean. So now we what's the next death? Uh oh. Uh so we have a scare that supposedly Brenda is to have supposedly been killed. Uh or was attempted to get killed, cuz Brenda was to go off swimming, and or what we assume is Brenda going off swimming. So all of a sudden Brenda is to make her way to this pool place to eventually have this scare that forces now uh, Natalie to try to get to Brenda to stop anyone from trying to kill Brenda, and that eventually leads Brenda to now hear the story of what had happened uh, with Natalie and Michelle, where they had pulled a prank on some guy, where all of a sudden, like, this guy was to kind of flash the high beams to let these girls know it's like, hey, you should probably turn on your lights. And so all of a sudden, these girls end up following this guy and continuing to flash their high beams to almost cause a car accident, which I remember in the Kevin Bacon movie Death Sentence, where there is to be these one guys where Kevin Bacon wants to kind of flash his high beams to say like, "Hey guys, put your beams on, guys. It's nighttime." And so all of a sudden, these people just followed Kevin Bacon to this gas station where eventually they end up killing his son, and that's what caused the whole death sentence thing. We've kind of seen a bunch of movies that have kind of done this whole prank thing where like certain people wouldn't put their high beams on, and then like the other person would flash the high beams to let them know, hey, put on your beams, or put on your put on your high beams, or put on your lights. Just, hey buddy, put on your lights so people can see you. And then all of a sudden that would cause them to most of the time follow these people for whatever reason. It'd be like this stranger thing. It's like, oh well, you were the only one that was there, you were the only one home, or whatever kind of thing. So pushing on, so the guy ends up dying because of this whole urban legend thing. So Natalie ends up telling Brenda this. I wonder why. So queuing up now where we transition, because there's to be Halloween parties happening, and so and there's to be very few people left seemingly in this cast. So here's the thing. So we end up seeing seemingly plenty enough times, or hearing plenty enough times, Tara Reid being this radio station persona that is to kind of tell people like how to do things, or they call to ask questions. Like in the very beginning of this movie, where Michelle is to be listening to this radio station, Sasha, who is Tara Reid's character, is to have this one person call in and is to mention how uh, this girl had given opposite medication and has been taking this girl's birth control medication and given this girl some kind of placebo, and all of a sudden her friend is now pregnant and she's wondering what she should do. And then there's another segment where Sasha is to get this call from this girl who, I think it's Felicia or something like that, where she is to have given her like boyfriend or whatever a BJ, and all of a sudden she's kind of paranoid because she ended up swallowing, let's just say, some sea man. Yeah. So she is kind of paranoid that maybe she's eventually going to get pregnant from that. And so Sasha's like, how about you just take some Pepto Bismol, and maybe the next time around, maybe don't like don't give somebody head if you can't like swallow the repercussions of that, so to speak. So because like there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with giving a little head. Like we also had like Damon Brooks, who ends up doing the dirty joke of when Michelle was to lose her head, how he's mentioned like, man, like that's too bad that she ended up dying because she gave good head. Get the joke, everybody? Yeah, whatever. Anyways, so we now tune into this Halloween party that is in progress, and so weirdly enough, we have Michael Rosenbaum's character, who is Riley, who is giving his dog supposedly beer, but I doubt that's what it actually is, and I doubt that that dog is actually being fed an alcoholic beverage of any kind or anything. So, uh, So the dog is getting drunk, I guess. So all of a sudden, everybody's enjoying this party. We all of a sudden have Sasha, who is to be at this party also, because she's gearing up to eventually go and eventually do her radio gig. And so there's to be one guy that is to mention, like, hey, did you hear that scream in that song? Oh, that scream is to have been taken off of an actual 911 call. That guy was weird. Anyways, so, but also cool. Anyway, because I'm sure, like, that guy was probably, like, some, like, did they, you know what? Like, there's some spots where you want to, like, just say that there was probably a director or a writer that they put in some spot, but it's probably just some random rando actor that they got. Anyways, pushing on. So eventually what ends up happening in this movie is that Natalie and Paul are starting to think that maybe someone is trying to uh, do all of these urban legends murders or just trying to kill everyone off uh, at this spot to try and reenact some kind of Stanley Hall massacre kind of thing. And so eventually, where it seems both Paul and Natalie have spent so much time together, and Brenda has gotten to the point of just saying, like, well, I want to just, like, I want a blue eyed man that eventually I'm going to just fall in love with and have kids and all this other stuff. To eventually have that taken from her by Natalie, who Paul is trying to comfort in this party, and then eventually they kiss, and Brenda is like, "Oh well, like I brought my friend beer, but I guess like she's not really my friend anymore because she's stealing my boyfriend or she's stealing my guy." Where it's like, "I'm sorry, Brenda, were you and Paul really close throughout this film?" Did you even try to do anything to try to get to Paul? No. Like, it just seems like the only thing of connection between her and Paul is for her to say, "Hi, Paul." And Michael Rosenbaum immediately is like, "Hi, Paul." That's all she had in this entire film. There was no her, like, switching digits with Paul. There was never a time where Brenda was trying to hit it with Paul. That just wasn't happening within this film. So for her to feel horrible about that whole situation that was never to work out, that was like having like Peter Parker in the Spider-Man movie, the very first original Spider-Man movie, where James Franco all of a sudden was like hitting on MJ, and all of a sudden like he was eventually dating MJ, and like Peter Parker eventually was like, "Hey, you're with MJ now, uh, Harry." And Harry's like, "Well, you never made a move. Like, so like I made a move because you never. So like freaking like yeah, so I made a move." Like, it was kind of like that situation where it's like Brendan never really made an actual move besides "Hi, Paul," and that's it. Like, "Hi, Mark." No. Anyways, so we go on. So eventually, Paul is to mention to Riley, "Hey, maybe we should call this party off because I think that there is someone trying to recreate the Stanley Hall massacre here, and a lot of people might quite possibly get murdered, so I think we should call this party a wrap." Because they still have that idea of like somebody's trying to create urban legends murders and try and like kill a bunch of people, and you can't do that, right? So Riley is to now like stop the music, delay everything, and now have to forcibly want Paul to explain why they are to stop this whole party. And so we have Paul who ends up explaining it, and like Riley just goes off and like, "God, this is like this guy just desperately wants this to become some news article so that way uh like he can be able to just make a huge career before he is to graduate in X amount of weeks when like his school year is up or his time is up." So Paul is just to run off because there's no way that anyone is going to really believe him. And so Riley eventually runs off because he ends up getting a phone call. And so uh, the phone call, he ends up going and thinking, he's like, oh, is this the urban legend of the person calling with inside the house? And the person's like, no, it's the urban legend about the wet dog who ends up getting put in the microwave. And so Riley ends up going into the microwave to open it up and just see the horrible remains of his dog, and he's like, "Oh, crazy!" Because that's what the TV version will tell you that he said. But in all actuality, like Riley starts cussing up, and then eventually he ends up going to the bathroom to vomit because he ended up seeing his horrible remains of his dog. And so all of a sudden, we end up having the killer going and taking Riley. And bizarrely, here's the thing that I kind of find foggy about this whole moment, because I'm not exactly sure what was put inside Riley's little tube of a thing to kill him off. Was it Drano? Was it like some kind of other kind of Drano kind of thing? Like, I don't remember what it actually was. Um, but yeah, so there was this blue substance put inside Riley to eventually kill him off, to have him choke on this and die. Uh, so Riley is now killed off. Eventually, we'll find him later in some like foam party when eventually Natalie's to open some door. So, so pushing on. So eventually, what ends up happening is that uh, we get to a point where eventually Natalie and Brenda are to try to make up for things, and so then eventually it all ends up uh, with both Paul, Natalie, and Brenda all driving off to eventually try to get to some phone somewhere. And Paul has already stated that they can't call any police or anything like that. Dean Adams has already mentioned to the police and everyone else that there's probably gonna be a lot of prank calls going on tonight, so just ignore all of that. And supposedly they have even given they have been even given Paul and Natalie's names and so on and so forth. So we go to this gas station moment where Paul is to try to get to a phone, and so both Brenda and Natalie are in this car together, and all of a sudden they end up hearing this ringing. So all of a sudden that ends up leading uh, to have them pop open the trunk to find Wexler dead in the back of this car. And so Brenda is like, hey, like, Paul, he's all yours, because evidently this was his car. So yeah, go ahead and have him. Like, he's all yours. Yeah, you just go ahead. So all of a sudden, that is to separate our characters, weirdly enough, because eventually Natalie is to end up uh, in the weird janitor's truck, where it seems that eventually Natalie is to distrust the janitor and eventually want out of the car, but the weird janitor is like, well, the door doesn't open from that side, so you're just kind of stuck in here till wherever I want to drop you off from. And so like Natalie's like, please let me out, please let me out. And we just have the weird janitor's like, what is wrong with you? So all of a sudden we have uh, Paul's car all of a sudden come into frame, and so the janitor is to flash his high beams to let him know, hey, like, you don't have your beams on or you don't have your lights on. So all of a sudden the car turns around and starts to follow this truck and starts to flash its high beams right behind this guy's car consistently. and then eventually that just causes the janitor's car uh, to crash off to the side, and so of course the janitor is now dead, and so Natalie ends up making it out of the car, and so eventually Natalie tries to make it back to campus, and she ends up desperately calling for help out of this automated service or whatever. This little thing where she ends up hitting this button to be like help, help from this weird like thing somewhere where I guess it's to be calling for help. So I hope I've kind of covered this movie, and it's probably going to be in a roundabout way. That's bound to happen, and then there's going to be some part that I probably remember from somewhere. So, uh, anyways, I think there was also a moment where they ended up thinking that it was the gas station attendant that ended up killing Michelle. So I think they ended up going and finding the gas station attendant. I think there was some part of the about that movie where they ended up saying that somewhere. Um, but I'm probably not 100% sure about that. You can rewatch the movie to confirm that or not. But I think that they ended up saying that somewhere where they thought the gas station attendant was the one that ended up killing Michelle, and like it wasn't just some like connection of all kinds of murders or whatever. Anyways, pushing on. So we have Wilson, who is to be this rent-a-cop, and she's to be bizarrely watching like Jackie Brown or something like that. And so eventually we have it to where uh, eventually I think Natalie is to try to get to Wilson and try to like tell her that things are going on, and so what ends up happening out of all this? So what ends up really happening? So all of a sudden, while Natalie is trying to call out for help, she ends up hearing Brenda into this spot that is originally the Stanley Hall massacre murder place. So Natalie heads into there, which is a place that is now like just been deserted, and she tries to find her friend Brenda, to eventually just see Brenda just sitting on this bed after Natalie has kind of gone through this place and started to open doors and find numerous things of her friends all dead, as well as Dean Adams, who isn't her friend, who is dead also. Just numerous bodies of dead people just stacking from out of doors and so on and so forth. Joshua Jackson, dead, hung. Michael Rosenbaum, hung, but like that's not important because he ends up coming from out of this foam room and he's dead. Hung. Anyways, go on. I had to freaking pat myself in the back severely after that joke. Anyways, so Dean Adams hung. Everybody weirdly hung. I don't know what it is. It's a joke. It's a joke that I kept on just bringing it up. Anyways, so Natalie ends up finding Brenda, who isn't hung because that's a whole different thing. She's just sitting on this bed, and Natalie's to think, oh, I'm too late. Brenda is to be dead because I can see the numerous stab wounds or bullet holes or any number of things that would signify this girl is to be dead. Like, is she breathing? Yes, then not dead. I would have just waited, just be like, can we see her chest go up and down? Is she holding her breath? Let's figure that out right now. Let's slap her in the face to see if she's still awake. Could have done that, but you didn't. So, Natalie is to assume that her friend is dead, even though there isn't really any hard evidence to really just say that. So, all of a sudden, Brenda ends up waking up from her slumber screaming to eventually just punch Natalie and knock her out, to have Natalie tied to this bed. And so now we get the big reveal that Brenda was the villain all along. man, was that a surprise, right? Because I've technically seen this movie multiple times now, and I already know who the villain already was. But still, like, even if I haven't seen this movie multiple times, you can still easily come to the conclusion that it's Brenda, because really, like, you can't think it's Paul. Like, for me in my head, I'm not thinking it's Paul. Like, I would have probably much rather have assumed that it probably would have been any number of people that were probably already dead before I would have naturally assumed it was Paul, that somebody could have faked their death, because I could have naturally just assumed that it could have been Damon Brooks and both Riley teaming up together, faking their deaths for whatever reason, and then eventually just be, aha, like, we're the villains of this story. Even though in all technicality, then why would have Riley died the way he would have? But still, I don't know. I was coming up with some kind of thing to just say, like, okay, like, there is something staged about this guy's death. Like, there was something staged about, like, the way they both died. I don't know. I was coming up with something. I was coming up with something better than Brenda, because even Brenda had a very flimsy thing going on for why she was to be killer in movie. So Brenda is to reveal to us that the guy of which that both Natalie and Michelle had killed was actually going to be her lover, who supposedly she was going to get an engagement ring from him because they were going to get married and whatever fairly soon. So Natalie used to tell Brenda, like, well, hey, why didn't you just seek therapy after all this? And Brenda's like, well, I did seek therapy and obviously didn't help. To where I wanted to go on a murderous rampage. Because the interesting thing was, like, Paul was trying to, like, pin all this on Wexler to think, well, maybe the real story here is, since Wexler was the last known survivor of the Stanley Hall massacres, because eventually the weird janitor had given him that news article, which I'm like, maybe the janitor is the killer. Maybe him going through the hallways and just saying boo to people makes him the killer. Maybe he bizarrely was to have actually been the Stanley Hall massacre murderer, and maybe he's just been biding his time for I don't know how long. Could have been a good story, but they didn't go with it. So, thinking a lot better answers than just Brenda being the killer. No offense to eventually Rebecca Gayheart, who is killer. It's just the best friend story. Like, I just don't care for those anymore. There's been too many, like, oh, it's the boyfriend, or oh, it's the best friend, or oh, it's the person you least likely to think that it's going to be that person, but you know it's that person. Like, you know it's going to be the boyfriend, or you just know it's going to be the guy that you know. You've seen too many of these slasher films, and you have to come up with the idea of who this person is. And you're like, I know who it is. I know it's that person, guy, thing, woman. Hopefully, woman, because you don't get a lot of female murders all that often, unless you go into the Scream movies for the eighth, ninth, whichever one, and eventually you find out, like, everyone's the killer. Everyone kills. Everyone does it. Anyway, so pushing on. So Brenda tells us that her boyfriend was killed via an urban legend, which pushed her on to eventually find Natalie and all of her friends and decide, well, you know what, I'm going to just start killing everybody based off urban legends, but eventually she's going to run out of urban legends to use, and plus also she's going to have to shoot somebody in the head to because that's bound to happen. So all of a sudden, Brenda is to mention that she is to pull off the uh, kidney thief urban legend, which I'm like, wait a minute, I had seen this one show on HBO Max. It starts with an F. It's like Flantanimo or something. It has some weird, goofy title, but it's some like animated. Uh, it's some animated show on HBO Max that starts with an F, but it has this weird title in it, and and that has a lot of urban legends into that also, where it has like one of like I think the early episodes is like the wailing woman, where eventually she was betrayed by some guy and she ended up like killing her kids and all this other kind of weird stuff, and like the pilot episode of Supernatural covers that same thing. And so the urban legend where this girl was to talk about that this guy was to bring home this one woman to all of a sudden eventually wake up in this tub with a kidney removed. I'm like, oh my God, that's from that show. Like I've seen that show and they talk about that urban legend. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But heck if I know what the actual title was. It's some like flang it's like flang Totemo whatever weird goofy title. I have it reviewed. I like covered like a huge bulk of like a couple of seasons of it. So freaking if you can find that, or you can just go into HBO Max and just look up F, that show will probably still be on there. Anyways, pushing on. Anyways. So we all of a sudden have a moment of which where Brenda is to start cutting into Natalie, and so I want to perfectly time this because I don't know who arrives first, whether it's Wilson with her gun or whether it's Paul who arrives. Also, I think it's Wilson who arrives. So Wilson arrives to stop Brenda from. Oh yeah, because Brenda has to get the gun. So okay, so it's Wilson first. So Wilson arrives with her gun to stop Brenda from doing what she's doing. And so what ends up happening is Brenda ends up taking out Wilson and ends up shooting her. And so all of a sudden Natalie is to try to like escape, and so Brenda is now having the gun on Natalie, and it's just like, well, I can't shoot you in the head because it's not an urban legend. It's like, what about Wilson? Like, how are we going to urban legend her death? Brenda's already been messing up some things. So all of a sudden, Paul is to come in with his golf clap. He's like, yeah, like, if anything, this is great. Like, now, like, uh, we'll just pin this all on Wexler. That sounds like a great idea. And and Brenda, you can give me all the exclusives of how exactly Wexler had killed everybody that only supposedly Wexler would have known, so that way I can get my exclusive and just like make a ton of money and just like, yeah, like you and me, like we'll be like. And Brenda's like, yeah, I think we'll be perfect for one another. Is like, yeah. Paul's like, yeah, this is gonna happen. So all of a sudden, so we end up having these characters that eventually are to like Paul is to play Brenda, but eventually like Brenda is to eventually figure things out. So eventually they end up knocking out Brenda and they end up like running for the hills. They go into the car and they try to drive off thinking that like everything is done, everything is covered, and everything is whatever. But then all of a sudden we get Brenda who does one last scare, who is in the back seat of the car. And so Paul ends up ducking both Paul and Natalie. And so Brenda is now like attacking them with the axe. But eventually what ends up happening is they end up quickly uh, putting a brake on this car. Brenda ends up, I think, going flying through the windshield, and then she ends up being tossed into this uh, this water, this river or whatever that they're on, because they're on some bridge. And so Paul ends up crashing the car off to this side of this bridge, and Brenda ends up going flying out of the windshield. That eventually she ends up going into this lake or whatever, where no one was to be able to find the body, for how powerful the lake was to just kind of take this body and toss it off to whatever. Well, it's kind of interesting when Natalie was to talk about this story and how eventually that the story was going to get jostled around, that eventually Paul will be some police officer and she'll end up in some mental hospital, and that everything will be changed, that Brenda will probably be a guy or something like that, and so on and so forth. So after Paul and Brenda are to dispose of, or after Paul and Natalie are to chuck and get rid of Brenda and have her die, the last thing that we end up seeing is that there's to be this guy named Blake, who is to have told this whole story in front of this new group of people at this school. And so all of a sudden we have these people in these like goofy looking clothes. Like, I'm just like, man, the people in the like the beginning of this movie like seem to have like regular clothes. Like, I don't quite understand why they had to like put these other people in here at the end of this movie and give them way more goofier looking clothes. I guess they were thinking like, hey, this is going to be the fashion of the future. Whenever this story was gonna come up in the future, I guess. So all of a sudden we have Brenda, who is to eventually come back into the fray, because Blake is to have told his story. I'm like, hey, does anyone believe me? And Brenda says, yeah, I believe you, but you didn't quite tell the story right. And here's how the story really goes. And that's how the very first movie finishes up. I'm like, so wait a minute. Like, I don't think they even go with the exact same killer in the sequel movie, which I'm like, so you have, because I think they wanted to have different things going on here. So, yeah, so with that said, I wrapped up this film. It took a while, but I did it. Of course, like, I apologize for pausing it a lot for this one. Like, of course, what always happens is the very last video for the day ends up being the most difficult. So this one took a long stretch of time also. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, buddy. Bye, buddy. Well, okay. Here's the funny thing. So I had completely. I don't think I even mentioned how Tara Reid's character Sasha even died in this film. So here's wrapping this up. I didn't want to do this because I'm like, oh my god, I have one full bit of footage all together that I can put out. And I'm like, oh crap, did I not even mention how Tara Reid was to die in this movie? No, I didn't. So, God, I just want to get this all, like, to make sure that I got, like, a bulk of this movie done. So, Tara Reid was, of course, to go off, because I think I just mentioned that she just went off to do her radio station. And I think that's where we have a certain number of our characters eventually, because Natalie goes off to try and save Sarah, or Sasha, because she ends up hearing Sasha on the radio station kind of screaming bloody murder because someone is after her. And so Natalie tries to go and save her at the radio station, and I think ends up trying to like have some of her friends with her, like Brenda and Paul and stuff like that, to try to save Natalie and whatever. So what ends up happening is, of course, Brenda ends up continuing to like run around throughout this whole radio station. She ends up trying to go back into her room at the end of all this to try and hide from this killer. But eventually, what ends up happening is that eventually the killer is to make it back to the other end of the room of where Sasha was to do her radio station. And so eventually we get to the point where like Sasha's running all over the place. Eventually she's trying to quickly run like through these flights of stairs till eventually she ends up just try to do this move to eventually quickly fall down these like flights of stairs. And so eventually this all just leads to eventually Sasha eventually dying because everyone has to. So I don't know an exact urban legend that Sasha was to die from. Like there's some of these urban legends where I'm just like, okay, I don't know every single one of these. Like Michael Rosenbaum brings up the one where uh, Damon Brooks was to die from, which was of course the scratching of the car where you see the guy who's hung and whatever, and like that was to have actually been an urban legend. And so you would have thought at any point in time anybody would have gotten like, well, I guess you did get Natalie who busts open this book of urban legends, and weirdly enough we had Damon Brooks who was the last one to have checked that out. So, and that's what I kind of thought was kind of interesting, where Natalie was looking through this book of urban legends to kind of see like which ones they all were. But here's the interesting thing: Natalie doesn't take that information and incorporates it into all of a sudden figuring everything out. Where it's like, oh, I know like where the killer is going to strike next, kind of thing. She never does that. She never takes that into account. So so yeah, I guess I like Sasha dying wasn't really an important thing for me to even bring up, but whatever. Like I guess I wanted to cover that to make sure that seems that everything was to have been covered seemingly. Because weirdly enough, like Natasha's guy that she was with doing this radio station, like he ends up dying, and then of course uh, Sasha is to eventually like see like where her like coworker like, hey, where's my coworker? And all of a sudden, like we have the hooded guy who has the knife and it's like, ah, like you better run. And so eventually Tara just runs off screaming bloody murder, and then eventually dies anyways because eventually like stupidity and whatever. But anyways, yeah. With that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. And hopefully that's it. Hopefully that covers everything. Uh, Trying to think of anything that there was left to cover. No. Definitely check out Michael Rosenbaum's Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. Check that out. There's any other people that have YouTube channels that are probably within this movie. Check that out too. Just try to probably search for like Jared Leto YouTubes or whoever YouTubes. Joshua Jackson if he has a YouTube channel. If any of these people have YouTube channels. If Tara Reid has a YouTube channel, check that out. I don't know. But with anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.